In this final episode of our series on the book of Ruth, even though we've already dealt with the climactic moment of the story, we are going to explore something at the end of Ruth that is shocking and unexpected. And it gives us a window into the character of God and how God means us to live our lives in a really unique and compelling way. So Ruth, part 6, trust his character. Let's dive in. All great stories follow a similar pattern, and they build to what Brad talked about in the last episode, a climactic moment. And we saw that with Boaz at the city gate where he ultimately redeems Ruth. But I want you to just kind of see a typical storyline for a story, and it will often begin in a place of normalcy where everything is settled, everything is okay, but then there is this inciting incident that will launch the main character, the hero of the story, on a journey. And so when you look at the story of Ruth, that inciting incident is the experience of famine and death. And then the way that story functions from there is you have this rising and falling action that's building tension and resolving it and building it. And it all builds to the climactic moment where that tension is resolved and the core problem of the story is solved. Now, in most stories, after the climactic moment, it's followed by what is called falling action, where loose ends get tied up and you get to appreciate the new normal for the hero. But that's not what happens in the story of Ruth. Ruth reaches its climactic moment, but then it goes someplace unexpected and really, really exciting. And it does that through, wait for it, a genealogy. Now, lest you think all those begats are boring, let me introduce you to a woman named Alice Playbook. Alice Playbook was gifted an Ancestry.com DNA kit in 2012. And so out of curiosity, she took the test, sent it away, and a month or so later, she got her results back, but there was just one problem. This couldn't possibly be my test. So she took another test, sent it back, waited a month or so. The results came back again, same thing. The problem was this: Alice Playbook had grown up in a staunch Irish Catholic family, but her genealogy, her DNA results were suggesting that she was half Jewish. Now, this launched Alice and her family on a 5-year investigation that culminated in the discovery that her father, Jim Collins, in 1913, had been sent home from the hospital with the wrong family. So an Irish baby went home with a Jewish family, and a Jewish baby went home with an Irish family. And all of this came out because Alice Playbook got curious about her genealogy. And as things like Ancestry.com and 23andMe and DNA testing becomes more popular, these sorts of things are becoming more commonplace. In fact, genetic genealogist C.C. Moore says, we see it every day. You find out that a lot of things are not as they seem, and a lot of families are much more complex than you assume. So don't make the assumption that a genealogy is a boring thing. So as we look at the genealogy that finishes the book of Ruth, I want you to just, in your mind, contextually speaking, think of genealogy as the ancient literary equivalent of a high-speed car chase. And the genealogy at the end of Ruth does not disappoint. So let's look at Ruth 4, verses 18 through 22, and dive into this genealogy. Now, these are the descendants of Peretz. Peretz became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of, and here's a word that you're probably familiar with, a name that you're probably familiar with, David, the greatest king of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures, a man after God's own heart. Now, what is so surprising and so satisfying about this genealogy as an end to the story of Ruth is that if you remember back to Ruth chapter 1, we learned that the book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges. And Brad walked us through how when you look back into Judges 21, 25, you get this kind of thesis statement about what the time of the Judges was like. It was a time when there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. But we have just walked through a story where Boaz and Ruth don't do what's right in their own eyes. They do what's right in God's eyes. So they're dramatically different from the culture around them, and their love and their loyalty and their faithfulness is light not only in Naomi's darkness, it's light in the darkness of the nation of Israel. So we get to the end of the story of Ruth, and we're expecting that God is going to redeem Naomi by providing her with an heir. And instead, what we find is that God doesn't just redeem a family, he redeems an entire nation. But it gets better, because this genealogy at the end of Ruth is going to get picked up and incorporated by Matthew in Matthew chapter 1 into Jesus' genealogy. So I want to read for you just a couple of verses from that genealogy and start to unpack some of the surprises that are in there. So Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. And then we'll skip down to verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Now, obviously, for purposes of space, I highlighted just the portions of Jesus' genealogy where you see Boaz and Ruth. But if you were to zoom out and read through the entire genealogy, a couple of things really jump out at you. The first is that in Jesus' genealogy, there are 5 women. And this is highly unusual. You typically don't see women in genealogies unless they're a matriarch, and none of the women in this genealogy of Jesus are matriarchs. So you have these women who are outsiders who are included in the genealogy. But then you get this concept of not just these women, but many of these women are Gentiles. Tamar is a Canaanite. Ruth is a Moabite. Rahab is a Canaanite. I mean, these were hated people. And I think part of what Matthew is doing is he wants us to see that Jesus is going to be the kind of Messiah who welcomes outsiders, who makes space for the marginalized in his life. And of course he does that because it's in his genealogy. Jesus comes from a long line of outsiders. And then the third thing that's worth pointing out, and Brad mentioned this in the previous episode, is just this connection between Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute of Jericho, and Boaz. And I think what Matthew again wants us to see is that Rahab is a foreign woman whose actions preserve the people of Israel. And you think to yourself, well, wait, if that was Boaz's mother, of course Boaz is going to be the kind of person who sees Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite, whose actions are preserving Naomi, this Israelite. Of course he's going to make space in his life for her. That's his story. That's his heritage. One of the commentators that I have so enjoyed reading from as we've gone through this series on the book of Ruth is Dr. Marian Ann Taylor. And she writes this about Boaz. Boaz models God's vision of generous inclusion and acceptance and points us to Jesus, who fed the hungry, ministered to those in need, and embraced the marginalized. And all of that is coming to us through Jesus' genealogy. So we get to the end of the story of Ruth, and we're hoping, we're expecting that there's going to be redemption for Naomi, and we are surprised that there is in fact redemption for Israel, and through Israel, there's redemption for the whole world through Messiah, Jesus. And so I think that one of the things we could say about this story of Ruth and about our own lives is that very often God is working in ways far beyond our comprehension. I know that in my life, I will often get all twisted up in knots, worried about some specific outcome. And very often I get to the end of the story and I see that God was doing something way bigger, far larger than I could have even imagined. It's like God had these bigger purposes of which I knew nothing. And I actually think that this is why faithfulness, like you see with Ruth, like you see with Boaz, is so challenging. Because very often, God's saving activity, God's presence is not readily apparent. So in Ruth chapter 4, verse 13, there's this interesting detail. When Boaz takes Ruth and she becomes his wife, when they came together, the text says the Lord made her conceive and she bore a son. And commentators across the spectrum, Jewish, Christian, they've all said this is interesting. Because even though there's a lot of talk about God in the story of Ruth, there are only two places in the story where God directly intervenes in order to bring something about. And this is one of those, when Ruth conceives and bears a son. The other place that God does this is back in Ruth chapter 1, when God remembers or considers his people in Bethlehem and he gives them food. And so a number of scholars have looked at the story of Ruth and just come to this conclusion that in the story of Ruth, the God of Israel is at best hidden in the narrative. So at some level, Ruth is also a story about the hiddenness of God. Hiddenness, not absence. And when you hold those differences between God's hiddenness versus God's absence, you can actually go through the story and start to see things a little differently. So for example, back at Ruth chapter 1, Naomi and Ruth, they arrive back in Bethlehem. Naomi is despondent. It's almost like she's just sitting there overwhelmed with her loss. But Ruth is like, I'm not just going to sit here. I've got to go find us food. And so she makes this decision to go out, and she appears to just choose a field at random where she could walk behind the reapers as they're gathering grain. And in Ruth chapter 2, verse 3, you find this little detail. So she went, she came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers, and as it happened, it's almost like the writer is like nod, nod, wink, wink. What a coincidence. She ends up in the field of the one man who's ultimately going to save her. And so you look back, and at the time, this just seems like a coincidence. But when you look into Ruth chapter 4, this pivotal scene at the city gate, something very similar happens. Now, before Boaz shows up at the city gate, the night before, he has this pivotal conversation with Ruth at the threshing floor. And it's there where he hatches this plan for how he's going to try to be the one who redeems her. Well, when chapter 4 starts, in the very next verse, this is what we read. No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin whom Boaz had spoken of came passing by. Once again, it's like this grand coincidence. Nod, nod, wink, wink. The coincidences aren't really coincidences. But here's what I want to say to you about God's hidden activity in our stories. is that so often when we're going through difficult things, we completely miss those little glimpses of God's presence. And we usually miss them because we're focused on our circumstances. We're so twisted and tied up in knots about what's happening around us that it's like our eyes are shut to God's presence in our story. And very often, it's not until we get through whatever the hardship is that we're able to look back with hindsight and say, okay, I can see now where God was in that moment. I can see how God was leading and guiding and shaping me. But what if I told you you didn't have to live with hindsight? What if I told you it was possible to live through whatever you're going through with a kind of spiritual foresight that allowed you, that gave you eyes to amplify the unseen ways that God is present with and showing up in your world? And my friends, the way that you do that is you turn your attention off of your circumstances and you start to trust in God's character. The story of Ruth at bottom is a story about the faithfulness, the loyalty, the love, and the reliability of Ruth and of Boaz. And they embody the loyalty, the love, and the reliability of God, God's chesed, that God's love is sure. His character can be trusted. He will not let you fall through. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to experience famine. It doesn't mean people aren't going to die. It doesn't mean you're not going to experience hard things. But God is reliable and can be trusted to be there with you and to work on your behalf. One of my favorite writers is a man by the name of Frederick Buechner, and he actually passed away last year. But he tells a story in his writings about a powerful moment in the life of his family. His daughter was in the hospital and she was battling for her life. And Buechner was depressed and overwhelmed with everything that his family was going through. And as he tells the story, he pulls his car off to the side of the road and is sitting there just engulfed in sadness and despair. And it was in that moment where he looked up and saw a car that was passing by, and on the license plate of this car was one word. And Frederick Buechner said that of all the words in the dictionary, it was the word I most needed to see and hear in that moment. And the word was trust. Now, he would later learn that the car belonged to a trust officer at a local bank, but he said, in that moment, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was a holy reminder that God was with me and that I could trust in his character. My friends, if you want to become the kind of person who has the capacity to see God's hidden presence in your story, we've got to become the kind of people who turn our attention from our circumstances and trust the character of God. So friends, there you have it. That is Ruth. And as I look back at these 6 episodes and some of the core ideas that we have journeyed through, I can't help but feel inspired and challenged. And there were so many times for me as we've gone through this series where I sat alone in my office and my eyes filled with tears because I was personally so convicted by this content and the ways that even as we were preparing this teaching series, I was challenged to live this stuff out in my own life. And I think that that is our hope for you with the story of Ruth, is that you would have your own transformative encounter, that these would be ideas that continue to inspire and challenge you. May you become the kind of person who trusts the character of God, and may you walk out the text well in your life.